It was a morning wrapped in a soft, pearly mist, the kind of November damp that clung to the hedgerows and made even the familiar lanes of St. Mary Mead appear strange and secretive. The village roofs were blurred into ghostly shapes, and the few figures that moved about seemed to float, half-formed through the fog. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from tonight? I love knowing where our mystery lovers are tuning in from around the world. Now make yourself comfortable, perhaps a cup of tea by your side, because this evening's story will take us deep into the quiet heart of an English village, where even the softest whisper can hide a deadly secret. And before we dive into The Woman Who Wrote Her Name on the Fogged Window, make sure you've subscribed and rung the little bell, so you'll always be the first to know when a new Miss Marple mystery begins. At Willow Mead House, a sprawling Edwardian residence just beyond the churchyard, Mrs. Elspeth Carrington was hosting her annual charity coffee morning. It was, as the St. Mary Mead Gazette would later put it, a gathering both respectable and restless. Respectable because all the right people came, the vicar's wife, the colonel's widow, the schoolmistress, and restless because such occasions invariably stirred the undercurrents of gossip that kept village life alive. Fog or no fog, one must make an effort, Mrs. Carrington had declared earlier that morning, adjusting a strand of pearls that seemed to sit on her like a badge of endurance. She was a woman of vigorous good intentions, though perhaps too fond of demonstrating them. Besides, a little discomfort keeps people grateful for the tea. In the corner of the sitting room, where a small fire fought bravely against the chill, Miss Jane Marple sat quietly, her knitting needles clicking in their unhurried rhythm. She had come, as she often did, at the gentle insistence of the vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement. "You see so much more than anyone else, Miss Marple," Mrs. Clement had said with a laugh, "even if you claim not to be listening." Miss Marple had smiled modestly. "Oh, one can't help observing," she replied, as if observation were something that happened to her rather than something she practiced with the precision of a surgeon. The fog pressed against the long windows of Willowmead House, turning them into dim mirrors. A few of the guests glanced out occasionally, remarking on how it felt like being in a cloud, or how you could lose a person just walking down the lane. But none of them noticed that, on one of the misted panes beside the French doors, a single word had been written in the condensation, a woman's name in looping, elegant script, Beatrice. It went unseen for nearly half an hour. During that time, conversation wandered comfortably across familiar terrain, Mrs. Carrington's efforts with the Women's Institute, the rising price of tea, and young Dennis Hawthorne's rumored proposal to the doctor's daughter. But there was tension beneath the chatter, a faint ripple that Miss Marple, without quite meaning to, felt rather than saw. People's eyes lingered a little too long on Mrs. Lydia Hawthorne, the young doctor's wife, pale, distracted, her teacup trembling slightly each time she set it down. Mrs. Carrington noticed it too. "My dear Lydia, you look quite peaked. Is something the matter?" Lydia smiled faintly. "Just a headache. The fog always gives me one." "Such a pity," murmured another woman. "You poor thing. Still, you mustn't let it get you down. Dr. Hawthorne can surely prescribe something." There was a ripple of knowing amusement at that, though Miss Marple's eyes behind her spectacles remained fixed thoughtfully on Lydia's face. The girl's gaze had flicked, just for a second, toward the window, toward that fogged glass where, as yet unseen by anyone else, the name Beatrice shimmered faintly in the dim light. It was Colonel Denning who first spotted it. A bluff, retired man of military bearing, he had wandered to the window in search of his pipe, which he'd set down somewhere near the curtains. "Good Lord," he said suddenly. "Someone's been doodling on the glass. Look here." The group turned. Mrs. Carrington gave a small gasp. "Beatrice? Who's Beatrice?" A dozen faces turned toward one another. Polite confusion, a touch of curiosity, and something else beneath it. "That's odd," said Mrs. Clement. "I don't recall anyone here named Beatrice." "Nor I," said the colonel, frowning. "Unless it's some sort of joke. The maid, perhaps?" Mrs. Carrington, affronted, drew herself up. "My staff would never behave so childishly." Miss Marple had risen and now stood a little apart, her expression mild. "It's rather a pretty hand," she said softly. "Not a maid's hand, I should think. The letters are graceful. Someone used to writing and perhaps accustomed to being observed." "Observed?" echoed Mrs. Clement. "Oh, yes," said Miss Marple gently. "Some people write their names not to remember who they are, but to make sure someone else does." A small silence followed, one that might have passed unnoticed in any other room. But here in the fog-muted drawing room of Willowmead House it hung like the mist itself, heavy, expectant. Lydia Hawthorne's fingers tightened around her teacup until the handle snapped clean off. "Goodness," cried Mrs. Carrington. "Lydia, you've—" But Lydia had already risen. "I'm so sorry, truly, I think I need some air." And before anyone could stop her, she was gone, out through the French doors, vanishing into the swirling gray. Miss Marple watched her go, her blue eyes thoughtful. "How curious," she murmured almost to herself. Colonel Denning chuckled awkwardly. "Young women these days. So dramatic." Mrs. Carrington, flustered, busied herself with napkins and apologies. "Poor girl. She's had a frightful time of it lately, I'm sure." "Has she?" Miss Marple inquired, her tone casual. "Well," Mrs. Carrington hesitated. "Her husband's been working very late at the surgery. People talk, of course, though I've no patience for idle gossip." "Of course not," Miss Marple agreed, resuming her seat. Her knitting lay untouched in her lap. "Idle gossip can be most misleading. Yet, sometimes it tells you where to look for the truth." Outside, the fog thickened, swallowing the garden entirely. Through it came the faint echo of hurried footsteps on gravel. Then silence. And somewhere, beyond the curtain of mist, a woman's scream tore through the morning air. For a moment after the scream, time itself seemed to hold its breath. Teacups froze mid-air, faces turned pale, and Mrs. Carrington's usually commanding voice faltered into a frightened whisper. "Good heaven, what was that?" Colonel Denning was the first to move. "Stay here, ladies, I'll take a look." His pipe forgotten entirely, he strode toward the French doors, flung them open, and disappeared into the swirling gray. The fog swallowed him instantly, leaving only the faint echo of his boots on the gravel. Miss Marple, still seated, lifted her head slightly, not in alarm, but in a calm, almost listening way. She had heard screams before, in many different circumstances. Some were cries of shock, others of anger. This one, she thought, had sounded very much like terror. Mrs. Clement gripped her arm. "Do you think something's happened to Lydia?" "I should imagine," Miss Marple said softly, "that something had already happened, long before she screamed." Mrs. Carrington, pale and flustered, clutched at the back of a chair. "Nonsense, Miss Marple. It's probably just a stumble in the garden. The steps are dreadfully slippery in this weather." But even as she spoke, Colonel Denning's voice called out from the mist. "Carrington, come quickly. Someone fetch Dr. Hawthorne." The room erupted into movement. Shrieks, gasps, the clatter of porcelain. Miss Marple rose slowly, smoothing her cardigan. She was not a woman who ran toward excitement, but she did follow, her quiet tread unhurried, her eyes alert. Outside, the fog lay thick as wool. The garden path was slick, the air heavy with damp earth and the faint scent of chrysanthemums. And there, at the foot of the old sundial, lay Lydia Hawthorne. She was quite still, her pale face turned upward, her hair spread across the gravel like spilled silk. "She's fainted," cried Mrs. Carrington, kneeling beside her. "Oh, please, someone hurry for her husband." But Miss Marple, bending closer, did not think Lydia had fainted. Her fingers brushed lightly over the young woman's wrist, not intrusively, almost tenderly. She felt no pulse. "Dear me," she murmured. "I'm afraid it's rather worse than fainting." The news spread through St. Mary Mead faster than the fog itself. By afternoon, every cottage window flickered with the glow of lamplight and speculation. At the butcher's, at the post office, and most vigorously at the Blue Boar Inn, people exchanged theories with the solemn conviction of experts. "Heart failure," declared Mrs. Price, who had once been a nurse during the war. "She was always a delicate little thing, poor dear. I said so only last week. Nonsense, countered Mrs. Weatherby, who prided herself on knowing everyone's business before they did. She was murdered. You mark my words. There's been something queer about that Hawthorne household for months. All those late nights at the surgery? Not all of them medical, if you ask me. And that name, what was it again? Asked another. Beatrice, wasn't it? Written on the window? That's right, said Mrs. Weatherby eagerly. No one knows who she is. Could be some woman from the doctor's past. Or his present, muttered the butcher darkly. At this everyone fell silent for a respectful moment before launching into fresh waves of conjecture. In another corner of the village, however, Miss Marple was taking tea quietly with Mrs. Clement. Her manner was calm, but her eyes carried the faintest glint of concern. You think it was murder, then? Said Mrs. Clement, stirring her cup nervously. I think, Miss Marple said mildly, that when a young and healthy woman dies suddenly after seeing her own name, or someone else's, written upon a fogged window, it's a matter that deserves more than ordinary explanation. Mrs. Clement frowned. You think she knew who wrote it? I should imagine so. The writing was too elegant to be idle mischief, and her reaction, the broken teacup, the hasty departure, all very suggestive of someone caught unawares. But who is Beatrice? That, said Miss Marple, smiling faintly, is precisely what we must find out. By evening, Inspector Cray from the county constabulary had arrived, a broad-shouldered man with a trimmed mustache and a habit of dismissing village opinion as idle female chatter. He was kind enough to Miss Marple, in the indulgent way younger men sometimes are toward elderly women, though he clearly thought her presence unnecessary. A tragic business. Miss Marple, he said, standing in the garden with his notebook. Doctor says it was poison, something swift and subtle, but he can't determine the source yet. Poison? Miss Marple repeated, almost regretfully. How very modern. People used to rely on simpler means. Inspector Cray chuckled. You sound as if you miss the old days of blunt instruments. Oh, not at all, she said pleasantly. But poison tells one a great deal about a person. It requires calmness, patience, and opportunity. Not everyone possesses all three. Cray nodded politely, making a note, though it was unclear whether it was her comment or simply the time of day he was recording. We're focusing on the household staff for now. Access to food and drink, you see. The cook claims she prepared nothing unusual, but we'll know soon enough. And Mrs. Carrington? She's rather upset. Says she can't think who'd wish Lydia harm. Miss Marple looked toward the house, its tall windows now glowing through the fog. People often can't, Inspector, until they remember what's inconvenient to recall. The next morning brought more revelations. Beatrice was not, as many assumed, a figment or a jest. The vicar's wife had recalled a young woman by that name who had once worked as a companion to an elderly widow in nearby Much, Benham, and who had vanished some years ago under circumstances best described as delicate. Some said she ran off with a married man. Mrs. Clement confided to Miss Marple. Others thought she drowned herself. No one ever found out the truth. Interesting, Miss Marple murmured. And Dr. Hawthorne, where was he during all this? Still at the surgery, apparently. He arrived just after she was found. Poor man looked shattered. Yes, said Miss Marple, almost to herself. Grief takes many shapes. I shall be very curious to see which one he chooses. That evening, as the village lamps flickered out one by one and fog crept once more through the hedges, Miss Marple sat by her window in her neat little sitting room. The death of Lydia Hawthorne had already become to some another sad but fascinating story. Yet Miss Marple knew that something more profound lingered beneath it. Someone had written the name Beatrice not as a whim, but as a message. Someone had wanted Lydia to see it, and Lydia, poor girl, had understood it all too well. Miss Marple set down her knitting and looked thoughtfully at the small square of fogged glass beside her. With one gloved finger, she traced a single word upon it. Why? And sat watching as the mist slowly swallowed it away. The next morning dawned no brighter than the one before. The fog had thinned only slightly, giving St. Mary Mead an air of uneasy suspension, a village holding its breath between disbelief and curiosity. In the high street, blinds lifted earlier than usual. At the post office, Miss Hartnell pretended to sort letters while discreetly eavesdropping on Mrs. Weatherby's version of events. which had now expanded to include a mysterious telegram and a quarrel overheard at the vicarage, neither of which, naturally, had occurred. Miss Marple, however, was not one for such overt gossip. She preferred her information gathered quietly, almost invisibly, like rain absorbed by the soil. That morning she walked, or rather, ambled on toward Whodunit House with a basket of scones and her usual air of benevolent harmlessness. She had already noted, with the precision of a clockmaker, the subtle changes since the day before, the drawn blinds at the Hawthorns' cottage, the hurried steps of the maid from the rectory, and the rare silence of the church bell, as if even Reverend Clement had felt the weight of tragedy. Mrs. Carrington herself received Miss Marple with weary graciousness. The once flushed hostess now looked pale and haggard. "My dear Miss Marple, how kind of you. I confess I haven't slept a wink. Such a dreadful business. Lydia gone, poor girl, and the police tramping through my garden." Miss Marple offered the scones with a sympathetic nod. The world can change so much overnight, can it? And yet in a village one always feels it more keenly. Every path, every hedge, all full of reminders. Mrs. Carrington dabbed at her eyes. "Quite so. Though between ourselves, Inspector Cray seems very sure it was poison. Something slipped into her tea, they say. And to think, I poured it myself." "Did you indeed?" "Yes. Though of course the pot was refilled once or twice and the ladies helped themselves. One never keeps track of these things." Miss Marple's eyes softened behind her spectacles. "No, one doesn't. Still, it's odd, isn't it? That poor Mrs. Hawthorn was the only one affected." Mrs. Carrington frowned faintly. Perhaps her constitution was weaker. "Perhaps," Miss Marple said mildly, though her tone carried a gentle weight. "Or perhaps she was the only one meant to drink from that particular cup." The hostess blanched, her pearls trembling against her throat. "You mean someone intended it?" "Oh, one should never leap to conclusions," said Miss Marple soothingly. "It's only that certain things remind one of other things. I recall, for instance, a case in Little Bletchley, a women's society meeting much like yours where a lady fainted after tasting lemonade. Turned out the jug had been tampered with by a woman who was thought to be her friend. All quite tragic." Mrs. Carrington swallowed hard. "People can be very cruel." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed softly. "Though cruelty often hides beneath civility, don't you find?" By midday the inspector had returned to the scene, his manner brisk and assured. He greeted Miss Marple with polite exasperation. "Still on the trail, are we? I dare say you'll solve it before I do." "Oh, I shouldn't think so, Inspector," she said sweetly. "You have all the evidence." "I only have impressions," Cray snorted, flipping through his notebook. "Impressions won't get us very far. Facts, Miss Marple. Facts are what matter. We've confirmed it was cyanide, though in a very small dose. Enough to act quickly." "How dreadful," murmured Miss Marple. "So unlike the natural order of things. Cyanide is so final." The inspector nodded grimly. "We've accounted for everyone at the coffee morning except one, the maid from Willowmead, young Elsie Dodd. Claims she was in the kitchen most of the time, but she stepped out just before Mrs. Hawthorn left." "Odd timing, that." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Elsie, fair-haired girl, rather nervous." "That's her. I saw her briefly. She seemed frightened, not of the guests, but of someone among them." Cray raised an eyebrow. "Oh, and who might that be?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Ah, that I couldn't say. But sometimes fear tells you who's innocent, Inspector, not who's guilty. It's quite a different sort of trembling." He sighed. "You'd make a fine detective, Miss Marple." "Oh, I do try my best," she said gently. Later that day, she paid a call to Dr. Hawthorn. His surgery, a small brick building attached to his home, was unusually silent. The waiting room was empty. The door to his office stood half open. He was there, hunched over his desk, his hair disheveled, his eyes red-rimmed. When he saw Miss Marple, he rose at once, attempting to compose himself. "Miss Marple, forgive me, I'm not receiving visitors." "I quite understand, Doctor," she said kindly. "I only came to offer my condolences. Such a loss, and so sudden." He nodded tightly, his voice rough. "It doesn't seem real."
Lydia was...
"She was everything." Miss Marple looked at him with quiet compassion. When one loves deeply, one often overlooks things others might notice. Especially small things, and a change of tone, a glance, a letter left unopened. He stiffened slightly. "You think I missed something?" "Oh, I wouldn't presume," she said softly. "But I did wonder, did Lydia ever mention a person named Beatrice?" The name seemed to strike him like a blow. He turned sharply toward the window. "Where did you hear that?" "It was written on the glass at Mead house," she said, her voice even. A name drawn with a finger in the mist. "Just before Lydia went out." He said nothing for a long while, then very quietly, "Beatrice Armitage. She was a patient. Years ago. A difficult case. Difficult how? She was an unstable. Depressive tendencies. She disappeared one winter. The police never found her. I told them she might have gone abroad, but..." He stopped, pressing his fingers to his eyes. "Good God. Do you think Lydia believed I had something to do with her?" Miss Marple hesitated delicately. "Did you?" He looked up sharply, then sagged into his chair. "No, but Lydia might have thought otherwise. I never told her the full story." "Secrets," Miss Marple murmured. "They have a way of writing themselves across windows, don't they? Especially when the glass is already fogged." The doctor gave her a puzzled look, but Miss Marple was already rising. "You mustn't trouble yourself, doctor. Grief makes everything seem sharper than it is. Still, if you should recall any small detail, anything at all unusual, do let me know." As she stepped out into the cool afternoon air, she paused on the garden path. Her eyes rested briefly on a low flower bed near the fence. Trampled earth, damp leaves, and the faint glint of something pale beneath the soil. She bent carefully and brushed it aside with her gloved hand. It was a fragment of porcelain, the broken handle of a teacup. Miss Marple held it up to the light, her lips tightening. "Oh dear," she whispered. "Someone's been tidying up too neatly." By the following afternoon, Inspector Cray had made what he confidently referred to as substantial progress. In the Blue Boar Inn, where his temporary headquarters had been set up beside the fire, he told a small audience of constables and curious villagers that the case was, in essence, practically solved. The obvious suspect, he explained, was the maid, Elsie Dodd. She had access to the kitchen and the teapots, he declared. She left the room just before the victim did, and she's been behaving suspiciously ever since. Suspiciously, in this case, meant weeping uncontrollably and refusing to leave her mother's cottage. Miss Marple, who had dropped in to deliver what she called a few scones for the constable, poor lad, listened quietly from a corner table. She did not interrupt. She never did, when men were explaining things they did not fully understand. But her pale blue eyes remained fixed on the inspector's face with a calm, unblinking interest. "She claims she saw someone near the garden that morning," Cray went on. "A figure in a gray coat, she says, though she couldn't see the face. No one else saw anything, mind you. Likely a fabrication to distract us." Miss Marple folded her hands. "Did she say what sort of gray coat?" Cray blinked. "What sort?" "Oh yes," said Miss Marple mildly. "There's a great difference, you know. Tweed or wool, man's or woman's cut. One can tell a great deal from tailoring. It's often quite revealing." The inspector sighed. "A gray coat's a gray coat, Miss Marple." "Perhaps," she said sweetly. "But in my experience, small differences are what separate tragedy from mere coincidence." That afternoon, Miss Marple took it upon herself to visit Elsie Dodd. The girl lived with her mother in a small cottage at the end of Mill Lane, a neat but humble dwelling, with geraniums on the sill and a cat sunning itself in the doorway. Mrs. Dodd, a stout, anxious woman, opened the door at once. "Oh, Miss Marple, do come in. Poor Elsie's beside herself, she is. The inspector says she'll be taken in for questioning." "As if my girl could harm a fly." "I'm sure she couldn't," said Miss Marple warmly. "I only wish to see how she's bearing up." Inside, Elsie sat hunched by the hearth, her eyes red and swollen. When she saw Miss Marple, she gave a tremulous little curtsy. "I didn't do it, ma'am. I swear I didn't." "Of course you didn't, my dear," Miss Marple said kindly, seating herself opposite. "But I think you saw something, didn't you? Something that frightened you." Elsie hesitated. I don't know what I saw. It was all misty-like. I went out the back to fetch some milk from the pantry, and when I looked toward the garden gate, I thought I saw someone. Tall, wearing a gray coat. Just standing there like they was waiting for someone. Was it a man or a woman? I couldn't tell, miss. But they was smoking. I could see the glow of it. Then they turned and went toward the lane." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "That's very helpful, Elsie. You've good eyes." The girl's lips trembled. "The inspector says I'm lying, but I know what I saw." Miss Marple reached across the table and patted her hand gently. You mustn't let clever men make you doubt yourself, my dear. They often do that when they can't see what's right in front of them. She rose, giving the girl's shoulder a soft squeeze. Keep your courage, Elsie. The truth has a way of coming out, sometimes through the very smallest crack. Back in the village, the mood had shifted. The initial shock had worn off, replaced by a sort of prurient anticipation. People were eager for anyone to be accused. Poor Elsie, sighed Mrs. Clement when Miss Marple dropped by for tea that evening. The way people talk, you'd think she'd confessed to it already. Yes, Miss Marple murmured. The village does so love a tidy answer. And yet I fear this one may be rather more untidy, Mrs. Clement frowned. You mean you don't believe it was Elsie? I believe, Miss Marple said gently, that Elsie's story of the gray-coated figure is true, and that it is the very thing no one wishes to hear, because it makes the picture less comfortable. Mrs. Clement leaned forward. But who could it have been? Miss Marple looked thoughtful. I've been wondering about that myself. A tall figure in a gray coat. That could describe Colonel Denning, could it not? The Colonel? But surely... Oh, I don't suggest he's guilty, Miss Marple interrupted mildly. Only that he was there, and his account of events has been curiously vague. You'll recall he was the one who found poor Lydia, alone in the fog. Mrs. Clement's eyes widened. You don't think... Miss Marple smiled faintly. No. But I do think it's unwise to accept things simply because they sound sensible. In my experience, the truth seldom does. The following morning brought an unexpected visitor. Colonel Denning himself arrived at Miss Marple's cottage, his manner brisk but uneasy. Miss Marple, I've heard you've been asking questions. About me? Oh dear, she said pleasantly. Not about you, Colonel, merely including you. There is a difference, he frowned. Well, I thought I'd better set things straight. I was in the garden, yes, but only because I'd dropped my pipe. Found it by the sundial just before the poor girl was discovered. How fortunate, Miss Marple said softly. Though I wonder, how did you see it in that dreadful fog? He blinked. Eh? Oh, well, I suppose I didn't see it exactly. More felt for it. Of course. Her voice was calm, almost kindly. Still, the sundial is quite far from the French doors, isn't it? It seems a long way to go for a pipe one wasn't certain of dropping. The Colonel's mouth tightened. You're implying something, Miss Marple. Not at all, she said sweetly. Merely observing that human beings often go farther than they mean to, especially when trying to appear casual. He gave a short, stiff bow. Good day, madam. When he had gone, Miss Marple sat for a long time by the window, her knitting untouched. Outside, the fog was lifting slightly, the outlines of roofs and hedges growing clearer. Ah, she murmured. The truth is very like fog. It hides the same people until it doesn't. That evening, the inspector appeared once more, frustrated, flustered, and convinced he was being misled. I can't make sense of it, Miss Marple, he said, pacing. Every lead turns to nothing. The maid's story's too vague, and Denning's account, well, there's no proof he did anything wrong. Miss Marple smiled gently. Perhaps, Inspector, you are looking for proof before you've looked for motive. The two don't always arrive in the same order. He stopped, exasperated. Then what do you suggest? I suggest, said Miss Marple, that the question is not who poisoned the tea, but why poor Lydia saw the name Beatrice before she died, and what she meant to do about it. The inspector frowned. And what does that tell you? Miss Marple's eyes gleamed softly. Only this, that the writing on that window wasn't meant for us. It was meant as a reminder, a warning from the past. The next day dawned crisp and dry at last, the fog having lifted into a pale winter sun. The air was sharp, full of brittle clarity, as though the world, like a long-smeared window, had finally been wiped clean. In such light, the village of St. Mary Mead looked almost innocent again. Almost. Miss Marple rose early, not because she intended to be out and about, but because she wished to think. It was, as she often said, a morning for noticing things that had gone unnoticed. She made her tea, fed her canary, and then, after a small and deliberate pause, slipped the fragment of porcelain she'd found near the Hawthorns' garden into her reticule. The broken handle had been troubling her all night, not because it existed, but because it didn't belong. At Willowmead House, Mrs. Carrington greeted her with slightly forced warmth. Miss Marple, dear, I really don't know how you managed to concern yourself with so many dreadful details. My dear Elspeth, Miss Marple said pleasantly. One never knows which dreadful details may prove essential. The drawing room was just as it had been that morning of the gathering, polished, floral, and faintly over-perfumed. The tea service had been removed and cleaned, though Miss Marple noticed at once that the tray itself had been moved from its usual spot near the fireplace to a side table nearer the window. She walked slowly toward it, her eyes mild, her voice conversational. "You do have the loveliest china, Mrs. Carrington. Royal Dalton, isn't it?" Mrs. Carrington brightened slightly. "Yes, the rose garland pattern. My husband always said good china shows good breeding." "Quite so," murmured Miss Marple. She set down her gloves, reached into her reticule, and produced the porcelain handle, placing it lightly on the table beside the teacups. "Though it seems this piece has gone astray from the set." Mrs. Carrington froze. Her gaze darted to the handle, then back to Miss Marple. "Where did you find that?" "In Dr. Hawthorne's garden," Miss Marple said mildly. "Curious, don't you think? One of your teacups so far from your house. I can't imagine how it got there." "Nor can I," said Miss Marple softly. "Unless, of course, someone carried it out. Perhaps while following Mrs. Hawthorne as she left in distress." Mrs. Carrington's color faded. "That's absurd. I never—" "Oh, my dear," said Miss Marple, her tone still gentle. "I didn't mean you, but perhaps someone borrowed one of your cups that morning. You see, this handle doesn't match the one Lydia broke, the one you so kindly sent home with her things. The break is on the opposite side." There was a long pause. The clock ticked once, twice. Mrs. Carrington drew a slow breath. "I suppose," she said tightly, "you mean that someone else's cup was broken? Another one entirely?" "Exactly so." Mrs. Carrington's composure cracked. "Miss Marple, I don't like these insinuations. You'll have me thinking everyone in this house is a suspect." Miss Marple's smile was faint but unyielding. "My dear Mrs. Carrington, in my experience, everyone is a suspect, until one understands what they were afraid of." That afternoon, Miss Marple found herself at the vicarage recounting her discovery to Mrs. Clement. The vicar's wife listened wide-eyed, hands clasped around her teacup. "So the cup Lydia used and the one she dropped wasn't the poisoned one?" "Precisely," said Miss Marple. "The poisoned cup must have been another, one that broke elsewhere. Someone cleaned it up and thought to hide the remains. But they missed a piece in the one I found. But why replace it?" "Why not let her drink from it there and then?" Miss Marple's eyes grew distant. "Because the person intended it for someone else. And Lydia's reaction changed the plan. When she saw that name on the window, she panicked. I believe she took up the wrong cup, the one meant for another, and left abruptly. That's why she died so quickly and why the murderer has been silent ever since." Mrs. Clement sat very still.
"Then the name Beatrice when it was meant to frighten someone else?"
"Exactly. The writing was bait, not confession." The vicar's wife's eyes widened. "But who was the intended victim?" Miss Marple smiled faintly as though at a private thought. "That, my dear, is the question that makes everyone so uncomfortable." By evening, the inspector was no closer to understanding her reasoning. "You're saying," he sputtered, "that the poison wasn't meant for Mrs. Hawthorne at all?" Miss Marple nodded serenely. "Indeed. I think poor Lydia merely walked into a trap set for someone else. But as so often happens, the bait caught the wrong fish." He frowned. "And who was the right one?" "Oh, that will depend," said Miss Marple, "on who had reason to fear the name Beatrice. After all, someone wrote it. Someone wanted it seen. And someone, I think, panicked when it was." Cray rubbed his temples. "You talk in riddles, Miss Marple." "I find riddles are rather useful, Inspector. They make one notice what doesn't fit." That night, long after the lamps of St. Mary Mead had gone out, Miss Marple sat alone in her cottage, her knitting lying forgotten in her lap. She was thinking, as she so often did, in pictures rather than words. She saw Lydia Hawthorne's pale face at the tea, her trembling hand, the flash of recognition in her eyes when she looked toward the window. She saw Mrs. Carrington's perfect hospitality, the colonel's convenient discovery, the maid's frightened testimony, and the doctor's evasive grief. And as if from somewhere far away, she heard again the faint scrape of porcelain, the sound of a cup breaking not in accident, but in haste. Slowly Miss Marple rose, crossed to her writing desk, and drew out a folded letter she had received earlier that day. It bore no return address, only a few neatly written lines. She saw her name because it was already hers to see. Forgive me, but I cannot stay silent. B. Miss Marple read it 3 times, her expression unreadable. Then she set it down beside the porcelain fragment and nodded once. Very slowly. Ah, she whispered. So that's how it was meant to be. The following morning, the quiet of St. Mary Mead was broken once again, this time not by a scream, but by the news that Colonel Denning had left the village abruptly during the night. His housekeeper reported he had packed a single case, taken his car, and vanished before dawn. When Inspector Cray arrived at Miss Marple's door in agitation, she was already setting out her tea things. Gone? He cried. Well, that settles it. He's our man. Miss Marple poured his tea calmly. Not necessarily, Inspector. Running away can mean guilt or fear. It rather depends on what one believes they're escaping from. Cray frowned. And what do you think he believes? Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. I think, she said, that he's running not from what he did, but from what he saw someone else do. By the time Sunday arrived, St. Mary Mead was awash with whispers. Colonel Denning's mysterious flight had rippled through the village like wind across tall grass. Every doorstep, every pew at morning service seemed to hum with speculation. Some claimed he'd run because his conscience had finally caught him, others because he'd been blackmailed. A few even suggested the colonel had been in love with Lydia Hawthorne and couldn't bear the scandal. Miss Marple, seated quietly near the back of St. Mary Mead Church, listened to none of it. She was watching faces, as she always did. Mrs. Carrington was there, though her usual poise had grown brittle. She avoided the vicar's gaze, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement, looked troubled, stealing anxious glances toward Miss Marple as if hoping she would somehow calm the rising tension in the congregation. But Miss Marple's gaze lingered most on Dr. Hawthorne. He sat alone near the front, his head bowed, his eyes dark and hollow. Once during the hymns, his hands trembled so visibly that he dropped his prayer book. No one helped him pick it up. After the service, Miss Marple waited near the churchyard gate. She didn't need to ask questions. She merely stood, her manner gentle and inviting as though she were a kindly old aunt rather than the village's most perceptive mind. It was Mrs. Carrington who approached her first. Such a dreadful business, Miss Marple, she said with a weary sigh. I can hardly sleep for thinking of it all. That poor man running away like that, and now the police are certain he's guilty. Are they indeed? Miss Marple's tone was mild. How very convenient. A man gone cannot contradict the stories told about him. Mrs. Carrington blinked, but surely it's clear enough. He was the last to see her alive. And that business about the name. Beatrice, Miss Marple finished softly. Yes, a curious business indeed. She looked at Mrs. Carrington over the rim of her spectacles. You didn't happen to know a Beatrice Armitage, did you? The woman's color drained visibly. Beatrice Armitage? She stammered. Why do you ask? Oh, just a small coincidence, Miss Marple said gently. Dr. Hawthorne mentioned her name. He said she was once his patient. But it seems her connections in the village went a little farther than his surgery. I really don't see what you mean, Mrs. Carrington said quickly. The name means nothing to me. Miss Marple smiled, but there was no warmth in it. It's very odd, then, that I found a letter in your husband's old ledger. You know, the charity fund book you keep by the sideboard. It contained a list of donors, most generous, and right at the bottom, the signature of Beatrice Armitage. Mrs. Carrington's lips parted in shock. You looked in my ledger? Only briefly, said Miss Marple, entirely unruffled. You left it open when the inspector called. I happened to notice the name. And I do so dislike unexplained names, Mrs. Carrington. They tend to grow roots. That afternoon, Inspector Cray stopped by Miss Marple's cottage, his face drawn and his manner weary. You were right again, Miss Marple. The colonel didn't get far. He's been found dead when in his car near the river bend. Looks like an accident, though the coroner says the brake line was cut. Dear me, said Miss Marple quietly. That's rather a thorough sort of accident. Cray exhaled heavily. We found something else, an old photograph in his coat pocket, taken years ago. Shows him standing beside a young woman, labeled B. Armitage. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. Yes, I thought it might come to that. Cray frowned. You knew? I suspected, she said. You see, Colonel Denning had that air of a man accustomed to respectability, and desperate to preserve it. Beatrice Armitage's disappearance years ago was no random tragedy. She was the Colonel's companion, not merely a friend. He met her when she worked as a companion to a widow in Much Benham. Their relationship became compromising. When the widow died, the Colonel promised to marry her. But then she learned he already had a wife. Cray's brow furrowed, and she disappeared. Yes, Miss Marple said softly, though I doubt she went far. The inspector's expression darkened. You mean he killed her? Miss Marple sighed. Perhaps. Or perhaps someone else did. Someone with a stronger motive to silence her. He looked confused. Who? Miss Marple's fingers toyed with her teacup handle. Mrs. Carrington, perhaps. She and Beatrice were once friends, though few recall it. The Carringtons moved here not long after Beatrice vanished. It seems Mrs. Carrington took a certain interest in ensuring no one spoke of her again. That evening, a tense stillness hung over Willow Mead House. Mrs. Carrington sat in her drawing room, staring into the fire, her pearls lying like small moons against her throat. When Miss Marple was shown in, she made no pretense of surprise. I thought you might come, she said faintly. You always do, don't you? When things are about to end. Miss Marple took a seat. You flatter me, Mrs. Carrington. But yes, I did think you might prefer to speak freely before the inspector calls tomorrow. The woman gave a sharp, trembling laugh. Freely? Do you think there's anything free left for me to say? Miss Marple said nothing. Silence, she knew, was far more persuasive than accusation. At last, Mrs. Carrington spoke, her voice low. I did know Beatrice. We grew up together, went to school in Bath. She was bright, cleverer than I ever was. When she came to Much Benham, I helped her find that post with the widow. I didn't know about Denning then, not until she told me. She was in love with him. Foolish, naive love. When she found out he had a wife, she wrote to me. Said she was going to expose him, ruin him if she had to. I panicked. I told her to come here to talk first. And she did, Miss Marple prompted gently. Mrs. Carrington nodded, tears glistening. Yes, but Denning followed her. They argued, there, in this very room. I tried to stop it, but she slipped. Struck her head on the hearth. It was over in seconds. Miss Marple's eyes softened. You helped hide her. She was my friend, Mrs. Carrington whispered. And he was a fool. I couldn't let the scandal destroy us both. My husband buried her, under the old roses near the garden wall. He never forgave me for it. Miss Marple's voice was barely a whisper. And the name either written on the fogged window? Mrs. Carrington shuddered. I didn't write it. I swear it. But someone knew. Lydia Hawthorne must have found something. Perhaps an old letter or photograph. She came that morning looking pale as death. When she saw the name, she knew I recognized it. I thought she'd tell the police, so She broke off, trembling. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. You poisoned the tea. She wasn't meant to drink it. Mrs. Carrington cried. It was meant for her husband. He had found the same letter, you see. Beatrice's letter to me. He came to question me that very morning. I panicked again like before, but Lydia saw it instead. She took the cup I'd moved for him. It was all a dreadful mistake. Miss Marple rose slowly. Mistakes have a way of revealing what conscience cannot hide. Mrs. Carrington covered her face. I only wanted to bury the past, Miss Marple. And yet, Miss Marple said softly, the past does so love to write its name where we can't help but see it. When Inspector Cray arrived minutes later, Miss Marple met him at the door. Her voice was calm, her manner composed. It's finished, Inspector. Mrs. Carrington will tell you everything. You'll find the remains of Beatrice Armitage beneath the rosebush by the east wall. Cray stared at her. Good Lord, Miss Marple. How on earth did you... She smiled faintly. Oh, one always notices the roses that bloom too early in the year. They have a way of feeding on secrets. For the next 24 hours, St. Mary Mead existed in a state of hushed fascination. The news that Mrs. Carrington had confessed, and that a body had been found beneath the rose bushes of Willowmead House, spread like wildfire. Every villager, from the butcher to the baker's wife, spoke with solemn conviction about what they would have done if they had been in her position. But as the village congratulated itself on living through another case fit for the newspapers, Miss Marple sat quietly by her window, unease growing in her chest like a shadow that refused to leave with the dawn. It should have been finished. The confession, the evidence, the tragic motive. all the neat threads tied together. And yet something deep down troubled her, not the crime itself, but its timing. When she closed her eyes, she could still see Lydia Hawthorne's trembling hand, the broken teacup, the way her eyes darted to the fogged window just before she fled. If Mrs. Carrington hadn't written the name Beatrice, who had? And why write it then, after so many years? Inspector Cray, meanwhile, was basking in what he considered a decisive success. "Case closed," he declared the next morning, shaking Miss Marple's hand outside the vicarage. "Body identified. Confession signed. I've telegraphed the superintendent. Clean as they come." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "You do make it sound very efficient, Inspector. But tell me, did Mrs. Carrington ever see the body herself?" Cray blinked. "Well, no. We've matched it to the dental records from Dr. Hawthorne's practice. He confirmed it was Beatrice Armitage. Said she had a distinctive gold filling." "Ah, yes," said Miss Marple quietly. "The gold filling." She said nothing more, but her gaze drifted toward the churchyard beyond the hedge. In the pale morning sun, she could see the faint glint of metal near the path, a small half-buried object catching the light. She bent down and picked it up. A cigarette case, silver, engraved. Inside were 2 cigarettes, one broken, one half-smoked. On the lid, barely visible through the tarnish, were the initials LH that afternoon. She paid another call to Dr. Hawthorne. He looked worse than ever, haggard, unshaven, his eyes ringed with exhaustion. His waiting room was empty, his surgery cluttered with half-filled prescription bottles. "Miss Marple," he said hoarsely, "I suppose you've come to talk about Elspeth Carrington's confession. I read it in the paper. It's horrifying, but at least there's closure." Miss Marple looked at him for a long moment. "Closure, yes. It's a word people use when they wish to stop asking questions." He frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean," she said softly, "that I'm not certain Mrs. Carrington killed your wife." He froze. "But she admitted—" "Yes, she admitted to poisoning a cup that morning," Miss Marple interrupted gently. "But not the cup Lydia drank from. Her confession matches the tragedy in outline, but not in detail. She believed she had caused the death because the evidence suggested it, but her story, you see, doesn't fit the facts." Hawthorne stared at her. "Doesn't fit?" Miss Marple reached into her handbag and withdrew the silver cigarette case. "You've lost something, haven't you, Doctor?" He paled. "Where did you find that?" "Near the churchyard gate," she said evenly. "I believe your wife carried it when she left Mead House. A small habit, perhaps. She always smoked when she was nervous." He said nothing. Miss Marple continued softly. "There's lipstick on the broken cigarette, the same shade she wore. But the half-smoked one bears a faint trace of cyanide." Hawthorne's eyes widened, horror dawning slowly. "You think she poisoned herself?" Miss Marple shook her head. "No, Doctor. I think she meant to poison someone else." The silence between them grew taut, trembling like a thread. Miss Marple's voice was gentle, almost sorrowful. "Your wife had discovered the truth about Beatrice Armitage, hadn't she? The old affair, the broken promises. But what she didn't know, and what I suspect she learned only recently, was that Beatrice was not dead at all." "Not then," Hawthorne's breath caught. "Not dead?" "No. She was very much alive when your wife came to this village. She had assumed a new name, a new place in the world, until she vanished again some years later. And Lydia found something, perhaps among your old papers, that told her Beatrice's secret." Hawthorne sank into a chair. "My God," Miss Marple went on quietly. "She wrote the name on the window herself, Doctor. Beatrice. A confrontation in fog, a name written to unnerve. She wanted Mrs. Carrington to confess and or to panic, but someone else saw her write it. Who? The same person who killed her." Hawthorne's eyes narrowed. "You mean—" "Yes," said Miss Marple softly. "Someone who feared what Lydia had discovered. Someone who realized that if the truth about Beatrice came out, so would another secret, a more recent one. Colonel Denning's death, for instance, wasn't an accident at all. Someone made very sure he'd never reveal what he knew." Later that evening, Miss Marple walked home through the fading light. The village was still, unnaturally so, the kind of stillness that precedes a storm. She passed the churchyard and paused by the lich gate, where the cigarette case had lain. Her sharp eyes scanned the ground and something glinted once more, a fragment of paper caught beneath a stone. She stooped and picked it up. It was torn, but the writing was unmistakably female. The ink was smudged from damp, but a few words remained legible. She suspects. If the truth of Beatrice comes out, I am ruined. He must not speak. There was no signature. But the handwriting was elegant and slanted. A hand used to keeping accounts, to writing thank you notes on embossed paper. Mrs. Carrington's hand, and yet the date. Miss Marple's heart gave a small, steady thump. Was from the day after Lydia's death. That night, she wrote a short note to Inspector Cray. Please come at once to Whodunit House tomorrow morning. Bring 2 constables and a pair of gloves. We have caught the wrong woman, though she believes herself guilty. The truth is never what people confess to, but what they conceal. J. Marple. The next morning dawned cold, crisp, and cruelly bright, a day fit for revelations. When Inspector Cray arrived at Whodunit House, Miss Marple was already there, seated by the same fogged window that had begun it all. Her expression was calm, her knitting folded neatly beside her. Inspector, she said softly, I'm afraid there's been a most terrible mistake. Mrs. Carrington did indeed hide Beatrice's death, but she did not kill Lydia Hawthorne, nor Colonel Denning. Cray stared at her. Then who? Miss Marple's eyes, mild as ever, turned toward the doorway. The person who could move freely between every house, hear every confidence, and be trusted by all. Someone who once said to me that gossip keeps a village alive. And so it does, especially when one controls which parts of it survive. There was a soft gasp as the door opened. Mrs. Weatherby, the village gossip, stood frozen on the threshold, her face pale as chalk. Miss Marple's voice was gentle yet unyielding. You wrote the name on the window, didn't you, Mrs. Weatherby? You knew what it would do to Lydia Hawthorne, and you knew what she might reveal if she lived long enough to speak. Mrs. Weatherby's teacup slipped from her trembling hand, shattering against the floor. The fog, at last, had lifted. For all the drama that had unfolded in St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple always believed the most decisive moments of truth arrived not amid shouting or handcuffs, but at the tea table. Human nature, she often said, reveals itself best when the cups are full and the tongues are loose. So it was that the following afternoon found the parlor of Whodunit House once again set for tea. The same china, the same tablecloth, even the same polished silver pot, gleaming faintly in the pale November light. Only this time, the hostess was Miss Marple. Inspector Cray stood by the hearth, uncomfortable and impatient. You're certain this is necessary? He muttered under his breath. We already have Mrs. Carrington's confession. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. We have a confession, Inspector, not the right one. Mrs. Weatherby will be here any moment, and we must let her feel perfectly at ease. Guilty people, you know, seldom speak when confronted directly. They confess to themselves, not to us, Cray frowned. And how exactly do we make her do that? Miss Marple smiled faintly. By offering her tea. When Mrs. Weatherby arrived, she was her usual self, brisk, composed, and full of false sympathy. Her hat was impeccably trimmed with black ribbon, as befitted a woman eager to appear respectful in tragedy, though her eyes gleamed with a suppressed excitement. My dear Miss Marple, what an unexpected invitation. I hardly thought you'd have the strength for company after such dreadful events. Oh, nonsense, Miss Marple said cheerfully. A little gathering is just what we need to clear the air. Inspector Cray and I were saying how nice it would be to put all the unpleasantness behind us. Mrs. Weatherby's eyes flicked to the inspector, assessing. Yes, indeed. Terrible business, though I must say. It's a relief the culprit was found at last. Poor Mrs. Carrington, such a pity about her nerves. Yes, Miss Marple agreed mildly, pouring the tea. So many nerves frayed lately. One hardly knows who to feel sorriest for. Mrs. Carrington, Colonel Denning, poor Lydia Hawthorne. At the sound of the name, Mrs. Weatherby's hand twitched ever so slightly on the tablecloth. The teaspoon rattled faintly against her saucer. Miss Marple went on as though she hadn't noticed. It's a curious thing, though, how one death always seems to stir another from its grave. I dare say Beatrice Armitage would be astonished at how much attention she's received these past few days. Beatrice? Mrs. Weatherby's tone sharpened just slightly, too quickly. Why, I hardly remember the name. Oh, I think you do, Miss Marple said gently. You remember everything, Mrs. Weatherby. It's your gift. Why, you've kept the village informed for years. Births, deaths, romances, quarrels. I imagine you even recall the smallest details from that time she worked in Much Benham. A thin smile appeared on Mrs. Weatherby's lips, perhaps. But such things fade, you know. I was barely more than a girl myself. Miss Marple took a slow sip of tea. Yes, and you lived in Much Benham then, didn't you? In service to the very same widow who employed Beatrice. The woman's teacup froze halfway to her lips. Yes, for a short time. I'd forgotten. I rather think you hadn't, Miss Marple said softly. You see, I've been thinking about how Beatrice Armitage disappeared. The police were so sure she ran away, but you would have known better, wouldn't you? You were there the night she quarreled with Colonel Denning. You heard what happened. You saw him drive away in the fog, and you followed her when she fled. Mrs. Weatherby's eyes flashed, but she said nothing. Miss Marple continued, her tone still light, conversational, the voice of a woman discussing jam recipes rather than murder. When she fell, and whether by accident or panic, you helped Mrs. Carrington hide her. Not out of kindness, but out of fear. You thought no one would ever trace it back to you. Rubbish, Mrs. Weatherby said sharply. You've no proof. Oh, but I do, said Miss Marple pleasantly. You see, when Lydia Hawthorne began asking about Beatrice, she came to you, didn't she? Everyone does when they want old secrets. You told her you knew nothing, but her questions frightened you. So you wrote her name on the fogged window at Willowmead, hoping to make her think Mrs. Carrington was to blame. You counted on the poor woman's guilt to do your work for you. The room went very still. Even the ticking clock seemed to hesitate. Finally, Mrs. Weatherby laughed, a brittle, humorless sound. You spin marvelous tales, Miss Marple. You should write novels. Perhaps, said Miss Marple softly, but I prefer people to confess their own endings. She turned to the inspector. Would you pour our guest a little more tea, Inspector Cray? The inspector looked puzzled but obeyed, handing Mrs. Weatherby the cup. She accepted it with shaking fingers. Miss Marple folded her hands neatly. It's the same blend Mrs. Carrington served, you know. A little reminder of that morning. Though I promise this one's quite harmless. Still, I couldn't help wondering how it must have felt, pouring from that same pot, knowing what was inside it. Mrs. Weatherby's hand jerked. The cup fell from her grip, spilling tea across the tablecloth. You've no right. Miss Marple said softly. You see, Inspector, that's what guilt looks like. People who are falsely accused go pale, but the truly guilty grow angry. The inspector stepped forward, his voice firm. Mrs. Weatherby, I think you'd better come with me. She stared at them both, her face contorting between fury and despair. You can't prove anything. You've nothing but old gossip. Miss Marple's voice was quiet. Gossip, yes, but gossip has memory, Mrs. Weatherby. You were seen at Willowmead that morning. Not by the guests, of course, but by young Elsie Dodd when she went out for milk. A tall figure in a gray coat smoking by the gate. I imagine you didn't think the maid would notice. Mrs. Weatherby's lips parted. For the first time, her composure faltered completely. That girl, she saw me? She saw enough, said Miss Marple. And now so have we. When the inspector and his men led her away, she made no resistance. Only as they reached the door did she glance back at Miss Marple. I didn't mean to kill her, she whispered. I just wanted her frightened. She was going to tell everyone about Beatrice and about me. She wrote me a letter, said she knew I'd helped hide the body. I couldn't let her ruin me. I thought the poison would only make her ill. Miss Marple's expression was sad but serene. People seldom mean to kill, my dear. They only mean to silence, but the difference is very small indeed. After they had gone, Inspector Cray sat heavily by the fire, rubbing his temples. I don't know how you do it, Miss Marple. Every time I think it's over, you find another layer. She smiled, pouring him fresh tea. Life is full of layers, Inspector. It's just that most people stop peeling when they reach something that fits their expectations. He chuckled wearily. And you never do? Miss Marple looked out the window where the fog was finally lifting to reveal a faint wash of winter sunlight. Oh no, she said gently, because underneath expectation lies truth, and underneath truth lies human nature. And that, Inspector, is always worth finding. The fog had gone at last. For the first time in days, the village of St. Mary Mead stood clear and golden beneath the pale November sun, every rooftop glistening with the soft dew of morning. Yet, as often happens after storms, there was a certain stillness in the air. The quiet of people who had seen too much and were now waiting for life to remember how to go on. At the vicarage, a small group gathered for tea. Not for gossip this time, but to understand. Inspector Cray sat with his notebook open, looking both tired and sheepish. Mrs. Clement poured the tea, her eyes full of lingering bewilderment. Miss Marple, serene and unhurried, occupied her usual chair by the fire, knitting resting in her lap. "Well," said Cray at last, "I must admit I'm still trying to piece it all together, Miss Marple. If you hadn't set that little trap, we might never have known. But I can't for the life of me see how all these threads, Beatrice, Lydia, Carrington, Weatherby, fit into one pattern." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "It's really quite simple, Inspector. The difficulty lies only in that everyone told the truth, but only their own truth. Each person saw a fragment of the picture and mistook it for the whole. Then perhaps you could explain it," Mrs. Clement said eagerly. "From the beginning, as you saw it." Miss Marple nodded. "Very well. We must start, of course, not with Lydia Hawthorne, but with Beatrice Armitage. Years ago," Miss Marple began, "Beatrice worked as a companion to a widow in Much Benham. There she met two people who would determine her fate. Colonel Denning, who pursued her romantically, and a younger maid named Evelyn Weatherby. Beatrice was ambitious, clever, and I think rather naive. She believed Denning loved her sincerely. When she learned he was married, she threatened to expose him. He panicked and turned to Mrs. Carrington, then a family friend, for help. What happened next was never meant to end in death. There was a quarrel, a fall, and an accident. Mrs. Carrington, terrified of scandal, helped conceal the body under the roses. Evelyn Weatherby, the maid, witnessed it all." Mrs. Clement gasped softly. "So that was the secret Mrs. Weatherby carried all these years?" "Precisely," said Miss Marple. "She left Much Benham soon after, came here and reinvented herself as a respectable widow. But she never forgot. She realized her silence gave her power. Power, Inspector, is an intoxicating thing, especially in a small village." Cray nodded slowly. "And she used it to keep them quiet." "Indeed. She visited Mrs. Carrington regularly, always under the pretense of social calls. I suspect she reminded her of the past. Not directly, but through little comments, veiled references. A form of gentle blackmail, though Mrs. Carrington would never have called it that. Then, a few months ago, Lydia Hawthorne came across an old letter in her husband's desk. A letter from Beatrice Armitage addressed to Mrs. Carrington. It spoke vaguely of betrayal, of secrets buried beneath the garden's roses. Lydia was no fool. She guessed there had been some tragedy, perhaps even foul play, and she told Mrs. Weatherby. "Why her?" asked Mrs. Clement. "Because everyone tells Mrs. Weatherby everything," said Miss Marple with a wry smile.
She presented herself as harmless, a confidant, a listener.
But Lydia's questions frightened her. She knew that if the old secret came out, her part in it would come out too. She might lose her standing, perhaps even face prison. Cray leaned forward. "So she planned to silence Lydia." "Exactly," said Miss Marple. "She wrote Beatrice's name on the fogged window, knowing Lydia would recognize it from the letter and panic. Then she slipped a little cyanide into the teapot. Not enough to kill outright, or so she thought. Just enough to make Lydia fall ill and abandon her inquiries. But she took the wrong cup," Mrs. Clement breathed. "Yes. Lydia's shock made her leave in haste, and she drank more than she realized. Mrs. Weatherby's plan succeeded far too well." Cray frowned. "And Colonel Denning?" Miss Marple's eyes saddened. He had been blackmailed too. Mrs. Weatherby visited him after Lydia's death, claiming she had proof linking him to Beatrice's disappearance. She wanted money, but Denning, a proud man, refused. She followed him the night he left the village and cut his brake line. I dare say she told herself it was an accident waiting to happen. The inspector sat back, shaking his head. "A quiet, church-going woman. It's always the ones you'd never expect." Miss Marple's smile was faint but knowing. "That's human nature, Inspector. Villages are full of people one would never suspect, because one sees them every day and assumes they are harmless. Evil doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers over tea." Mrs. Clement shivered. "And poor Mrs. Carrington. She really believed she'd done it all along." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "Her guilt over Beatrice's death was a festering wound. When Lydia died, she saw it as punishment at last. People with delicate consciences often confess to the wrong sin, you know. It relieves the pressure without uncovering the real cause." Cray nodded gravely. "She'll be cleared now, of course." "And Mrs. Weatherby?" "She'll be charged," said Miss Marple. "But I suspect she won't live to stand trial. A woman like that, built entirely on reputation, cannot survive its ruin. Her punishment has already begun." The inspector closed his notebook. "Well, Miss Marple, I'll say it again. You've done what no one else could. How do you always manage it?" Miss Marple's expression softened into something almost wistful. "It's quite simple, really. People always think in grand motives: greed, jealousy, love. But in my experience, the truest motive is fear. Fear of discovery, fear of shame, fear of losing one's place in the world. That, Inspector, is the root of most wickedness and most tragedy." The conversation drifted after that, from murder to weather, from justice to the church fete scheduled for next month. As the afternoon light slanted through the vicarage window, Miss Marple rose to leave. Outside, the village had already begun to settle back into its tranquil rhythm. The milkman's cart rattled down the lane. A child called for her dog, and the world went on as it always does, seemingly unchanged. Yet Miss Marple paused by the churchyard gate, where the last of the fog still clung to the grass. For a moment she thought she saw faint writing on the window of the vicarage hall. Not real, of course, just the reflection of sunlight on glass. But it reminded her somehow of that first fateful word, Beatrice. She smiled sadly. "Poor creature," she murmured. Even in death she wanted only to be remembered. Then, gathering her shawl about her shoulders, she turned down the lane toward home. Her steps were slow but steady, the measured tread of someone who had seen too much of human frailty to ever be surprised again. A week had passed since Mrs. Weatherby's arrest, and St. Mary Mead had begun, as villages always do, to fold the extraordinary back into the ordinary. The fog was gone, replaced by thin, winter sunlight that spilled across frosted hedgerows and gleamed faintly on the church's leaded windows. The lane smelled of wood smoke and damp leaves, and the butcher's boy once again whistled as he made his morning deliveries. It was as though nothing dreadful had ever happened at all. Almost. For those who looked more closely, as Miss Marple always did, there were changes, quiet and unspoken. The curtains at Whodunit House remained drawn, though Mrs. Carrington was said to be convalescing with relatives in Bath. Dr. Hawthorne had given up his practice and gone to London for a time of reflection, and the villagers, who had once flocked to Mrs. Weatherby for every scrap of gossip, now crossed the street rather than speak her name aloud. It was late afternoon when Miss Marple took her usual walk through the village, basket on her arm, stopping here and there to exchange polite words. A loaf from the baker, a nod from the vicar, a smile from Mrs. Clement. Her steps carried her past the churchyard and down the lane toward the old Hawthorne cottage, now shuttered and still. There, beneath the skeletal branches of the apple trees, she paused. The air was still, faintly metallic with the scent of frost. She looked at the garden gate, the place where weeks ago a frightened maid had glimpsed a figure in a gray coat, and she sighed softly. "So much sorrow," she murmured. "Born of the simplest things. A name, a secret, a little too much pride." Later that evening, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting untouched, her thoughts gentle and far away. The clock ticked softly and the canary dozed beneath its cover. Outside, the world was very quiet. A letter lay on the table beside her. The handwriting was careful but uncertain, Mrs. Carrington's. Miss Marple had read it twice already, but now she unfolded it again as if to read the spaces between the words. "My dear Miss Marple, I cannot thank you enough for your kindness and understanding. To have lived so long under the weight of one's conscience is a punishment in itself. I believe I shall never again look upon a rose without thinking of the friend I wronged, nor a cup of tea without remembering the price of silence. If it is not too much to ask, will you think kindly of me, as one who erred more from fear than malice? Yours sincerely, Elspeth Carrington." Miss Marple folded the letter neatly and placed it back on the table. Her expression was neither forgiving nor condemnatory, merely thoughtful. "Fear again," she murmured. "Always fear. It drives the good to folly and the foolish to evil." She looked into the fire, its glow soft against the silver of her hair. "And yet," she added softly, "there's something rather touching in it, too. That human wish to be thought better than we are." The following morning brought a visit from Inspector Cray, who looked rather more humbled than his usual brisk self. He stood awkwardly in Miss Marple's parlor, hat in hand, his mustache damp from the mist outside. "I wanted to tell you in person, Miss Marple," he said. "Mrs. Weatherby. Well, she's gone. Took her own life last night in her cell. Left a note, too. Said you were right. Said she'd rather join Beatrice in silence than face the noise of judgment." Miss Marple's knitting paused for only a moment. "Poor soul," she said softly. "It's often easier to live with guilt than with discovery. She must have been very tired." Cray nodded awkwardly. "You're not sorry she's gone, are you?" Miss Marple gave him a small, reproachful look. "My dear Inspector, one is always sorry when a life ends in loneliness, even when it's deserved. Evil rarely comes from monsters. It comes from people who cannot bear to be found out." The inspector looked at her for a moment as though wanting to say more, then simply tipped his hat. "You're a remarkable woman, Miss Marple. I'm beginning to think Scotland Yard could do with someone like you." Miss Marple smiled. "Oh, I dare say you already have plenty of clever men, Inspector. What you lack, perhaps, are people who listen. That's all detecting really is. Listening carefully and remembering that everyone tells the truth. Just not the same truth." Cray chuckled ruefully. "Then I suppose we should all learn to listen like you." When he had gone, Miss Marple sat for a long while in the quiet, listening to the faint chime of the church bell drifting through the window. A cat padded across her garden wall, its tail raised against the pale light. Life as always went on. She rose at last and crossed to the window. Her reflection gazed back at her from the glass, faint, blurred slightly by her breath. For a moment, she reached out and traced a small circle in the condensation with one finger. Then, very gently, she wrote a single word. "Remember." The letters glowed faintly in the dimming light, then slowly faded as the glass cleared. Miss Marple smiled to herself. "Yes," she whispered. "That's what we must do. Not forgive too easily, nor condemn too swiftly, but simply remember." She turned away, adjusting the lace curtain. Outside, the village lamps were flickering to life one by one, their glow soft and golden against the dusk. A cart rumbled by. Children's laughter floated faintly in the distance, and the first stars began to show through the thinning clouds. All was peaceful again, deceptively so. Perhaps, but peaceful nonetheless. Miss Marple settled once more by her fire, picked up her knitting and resumed her quiet, steady rhythm. The wool slipped through her fingers like time itself, looping and unlooping, one mystery ending just as another began. And though no one in St. Mary Mead spoke any longer of Lydia Hawthorne, or of the woman named Beatrice, or of the one who wrote her name on the fogged window, their story lingered all the same, woven like a single fine thread into the tapestry of village life. For such is the way of human hearts in English villages, the past never vanishes. It merely settles quietly beneath the roses, before you slip away into the mist, dear listener. If you enjoyed this tale of secrets, whispers, and quiet justice in the heart of an English village, don't forget to subscribe and ring the little bell so you never miss another Miss Marple mystery. Tell us in the comments, did you suspect the true culprit before Miss Marple did? Your likes and shares help us bring more of Agatha Christie's world to life. One murder, one teacup, and one clever deduction at a time. Until next time, keep your kettle warm, your eyes sharp, and your heart kind. Because in every quiet village, someone always knows more than they seem.